crop where you have like we have 3 different varieties of winter peas coming up. The grassy looking stuff, that's a triticale. There's vetch. This is common vetch, and then we have hairy vetch popping up. We have crimson clover, yellow blossom sweet clover, and then a handful of other things. We did some oats, some winter oats too, and so really we're optimizing, trying to utilize the photosynthetic power of the sun to grow plants in the winter that are cycling carbon from the atmosphere, dumping it into the soil, and thereby feeding the biology in the soil. And so for every tablespoon of healthy soil, there should be more living organisms than all humans on the face of the planet since the starting of time. When we bought the ranch, all of our farmed fields had less than 0.5% of organic matter. So that's less than 0.5% of what should have been in the soil. And that's not unique to this ranch. That is all lands, all agricultural production lands globally have been degraded to that level. And Phil was talking about in our lifetime, you know, we're not going to be able to grow food because we're not going to have soil. Well, he's talking about the Food and Agriculture Organization. It's a division of the United Nations which actually studied world soil health, and they concluded that in 60 years with our current industrialized system that's based on maximum extraction at maximum efficiency, we will no longer have topsoil. We'll no longer be able to grow food without chemical inputs in 60 years. And that was like 5 years ago. So that's a real big fucking problem. And so with these cover crops, we'll talk about the 5 key principles of regenerative agriculture and soil health. And this shit works everywhere. It works if you're in Texas, the Dakotas, Patagonia. It's just like principles that are consistent with Mother Nature. And so one is having a green growing plant year round. Because, you know, in Texas it's very common and this is actually more than Texas, anyone that grows hay, they'll do one last cutting before this grass goes dormant, and then they'll leave their grass like this all winter. And like, what the shit kind of habitat is that, right? And so this is one of the fields where we have hundreds of thousands of meadowlarks coming in and out in the morning and evening. And they're all nesting in this cover, right? And so that's important. But what this also does with the cover crops is it covers bare soil. And so you can actually put your finger in the soil here and it's moist. This hasn't had water in about 10 days. Whoa. Yeah, and so, you know, we're continuing to preserve that moisture by just providing a little bit of a barrier against wind, against sun, and we're utilizing and we're retaining that. So healthy soil is like a sponge. The more carbon you have in soil, the more rain you can hold. And so that has everything to do with resilience, you know. Talk about like, hey, we're in a drought or there's a flash flood. Look at your soil, because for every 1% organic matter you can have in your soil, you're holding 20,000 gallons of rainfall in a single acre, right? And this soil here has the potential to be above 10% organic matter. And so in one rain event, from here to where we started today, that could be 1 million gallons of rainfall in just 1 inch. And it's all about, well, do you use that rain or do you lose it? And the only way you're going to utilize it is with healthy soil.
That's the top end, about 10% carbon, you think?
Historically, this area. Yeah, there's some areas that's like 30% up in Montana and Wyoming.
I'm thinking like marsh areas and those things, and then some lands are less. Yeah. And then I think what soil is, since we're going to talk about principles of soil health, is really important. Soil is like this tiny, tiny, thin layer of skin around most of the land mass of the earth. There's not very much of it, and there's a finite amount, and it takes an involved process to create it, but all terrestrial life absolutely fundamentally relies on it. That's why we're talking about dirt and soil and these issues, right? And you know, when we talk about the 5 principles, we'll list those down in a second, but what those are trying to do are conserve and rebuild that critical component of all terrestrial life, which is the soil itself. And in opposition to that is what we see with industrial and chemical agriculture that produces the food that the entire planet relies on by and large, doing these things that actually degrade that resource. They degrade it by putting chemicals on it that actually kill the important life within it. They degrade it by leaving it bare and uncovered so it actually gets baked in the sun and carbon oxidizes out of it. They degrade it by tilling it, which allows it to blow away in the wind, or in the case of the United States, billions of tons run off into the ocean, actually clogging waterways and taking some of those toxic chemicals and spreading it all over the place, leading to dead zones and other things. And so there's a lot of things that we do to something that we fundamentally rely on to survive, to destroy it at our own demise, right? And I think, Phil, you were bringing up, and Taylor brought up the stat about, at the current rate of decline, there's only a few decades of time left before we're going to no longer be able to produce the food that we need to sustain the human species. And what happens when we have these scarcity issues? You get death and war and fighting over resources, and even more of what you were saying that we're trying to avoid, which is clashing social situations.